which I've now done. So welcome everyone to our weekly call. And as you're hopefully aware, this week I thought we would sort of at least initially have a discussion focused around Encrypted Client Hello, or ECH. So that will be the theme for at least the first half of the discussion. And should anyone be interested in accessing the documents I'm going to refer to, I will put a link in the chat for you to access the content. But what I'm going to do is to share my screen. So hopefully this will work at the first attempt. So can you see a slide on your screens? Hopefully you can.
Yep. Yes, thanks.
Fantastic. Right, so what I'm going to do is talk about the impact, or potential impact, I should say, of the proposed ECH standard on the education and finance sectors in particular. The reason for that maybe slightly unusual focus will become apparent in a moment. Let me just see if I can scroll through. But before I sort of go into that, just firstly, by way of a reminder for those of you that aren't following the minutiae of the sort of ECH development, it's being worked on within the TLS working group, and therefore is a mechanism that builds on TLS 1.3 or later to and I'm reading this. Oh, this text is effectively lifted from the standard document for encrypting a client hello message under a server public key. And you can find more details if you're interested in RFC 8744, which talks a little about the sort of requirements for S&I encryption within TLS. So effectively it replaces developments previously sort of labeled ESNI, just with a slightly broader remit. And if you've not been sort of following the developments closely, is just about at the stage of interoperability testing. So the discussion, in fact, at ATF 111 and on the TLS list at the moment is really just sort of finalising the draft 13 spec. And I think the intent is to do the interoperability testing based on that draft. And if I share the slides afterwards, you can sort of use the links in those if you wish to jump to the relevant material. So that's just a brief bit of background to give you some context on what ECH is. So it's all about encrypting the SNI data, amongst other things. Now within RFC 8744, section 2.1 sort of talks about what it phrases as unanticipated usage of SNI info, which is arguably a strange way of referring to permissionless innovation, but there you are. And section 2.3 sort of discusses end-to-end alternatives to SNI, having acknowledged that there are some, quotes, unanticipated usages. But if you look at the document, you'll see that neither of those sections is especially detailed and certainly not exhaustive in what they look at. I think they're each sort of 2 or 3 paragraphs in length to give you a sort of a rough idea, but you can obviously look at the text yourself. So with that in mind, we had a roundtable discussion to look at the potential impacts of ECH, with particular focus on the education and finance sectors, and therefore bringing people into the discussion with expertise in those two sectors. But given it was under the Chatham House rule, I shan't be any more specific than that in terms of either the individuals or the organisations that were involved, for reasons that those of you that have read the Chatham House rule will hopefully perfectly well understand. So what I'm going to run through just sort of teases out some of the key points from both that roundtable discussion and also from the subsequent analysis. But you'll find more details, both in terms of the sort of notes from the discussion, but also the subsequent analysis in the link I've posted in the chat and is visible on the slide. So there are two documents, one with the narrative and one with the analysis for your perusal. So what I'm going to do here is to summarize both the discussion and the analysis. But as I say, you can read in more detail at your leisure. Key points that really came out, and obviously this is heavily summarized to make it manageable on a couple of slides. Firstly, looking at the education sector, fundamentally, the conclusion of the discussion was that ECH is likely to sort of circumvent some of the safeguards built into protect children through content filtering. In some ways, building on problems already in existence due to the introduction of DOE. And the sort of part of the conclusion of the discussion whilst it might be possible to mitigate those effects, the mitigations would potentially be a lot more intrusive than the use of SNI. In other words, to mitigate for sort of privacy protections, you end up with less privacy, which is somewhat ironic. Similarly, looking at the finance sector, and again, clearly heavily summarized, already they're seeing some issues caused by the introduction of protocols such as DOE, which are causing some concerns. In fairness, not exclusive to the finance sector. I think these are fairly well documented in other sectors, but the focus in the discussion happened to be finance. There were particular concerns in finance that they have requirements, some of which are regulatory requirements, to have clear audit trails of communications with third parties, which could be bypassed by the introduction of things like ECH, and also the potential loss of visibility of malicious content, command and control, communications and other malicious software activity. And again, the conclusion in essence was to mitigate against those effects. It would likely mean that the introduction of far more invasive measures at endpoints than is currently the case with the availability of SNI. So again, in order to deal with these sort of privacy protections, it would actually be sort of weaken privacy quite significantly of users to continue to provide the necessary protections.
Can I ask a question before you move on?
Of course you can, Paul. Yeah.
Was it mentioned that this type of privacy protection is already being worked around by the surveillance capitalism crowd by giving each user their own server name to connect to, all of which are contained under a wildcard X509 cert, but each of which is bespoke for a given target?
To be fair, I don't know that didn't come up in the discussion, although I think there was certainly discussion about sort of they seem to ignore issues at endpoints, which I think is broadly what you're sort of driving at there, that you get the illusion maybe of privacy protection with things like SNI, but that is not necessarily as strong as you might imagine.
Thank you.
So three main conclusions. One, if you look at the RFC, there's certainly no evidence that some of what appear to be quite significant negative impacts arising from the introduction of ECH have been thoroughly considered within the working group. If they are certainly not documented within the RFC. To mitigate against its introduction, the privacy of end users will likely be eroded further, because you can go from things like transparent proxies to far more intrusive software, DPI, etc., being required to sort of mitigate the introduction of ECH. In the education sector, it does raise concerns relating to child safety, and certainly in the finance sector raises concerns related to increased potential for fraud and greater exposure to cybersecurity risks. Which then leads to three primary recommendations. One is to undertake proper multi-stakeholder engagement to understand the implications and the availability of suitability of mitigations against those implications. Potentially could lead to regulatory or legislative interventions to sort of deal with some of the issues in the absence of any other solutions. And finally, if sort of looking at the trend of things like DOE and now ECH and others and extrapolating forward, if the net effect of those is to make current content filtering solutions ineffective, then one option would be to look to the browser companies and operating system companies to themselves introduce appropriate content filtering as an alternative, since it is needed in some use cases. So then finally, then in terms of recommended next steps, just to expand on the multi-stakeholder review, very much do that, and that's sort of fully consistent with RFC 8890, the internet is for end users, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and that needs to consider both the operational and the policy implications of the deployment of ECH, something which I know is often not, certainly the latter, the policy implications, often not fully considered within the IETF, but is real and does need to be thought about, and certainly will be very relevant to some of those affected stakeholders. Absent any changes being made, then the alternative, as I said, is potentially regulatory interventions, both to protect the use cases impacted by the introduction of ECH, and also to address the antitrust sort of detriments suffered by the existing content filtering companies. And then finally, on content filtering itself, I think it's important that the benefits that it brings in some use cases need to be recognized, and that I know has been, I think, at least controversial in some circles within the IETF. So I think there's a much needed discussion that needs to be had there. And potentially the proposals need to be brought forward so to see what routes there are to maintain the benefits that content filtering brings if the sort of current trajectory of standards development continues, that seems determined to bypass those current protections. I'll pause there because Paul has raised his hand, and that was really coming towards a conclusion anyway. So, Paul.
Thank you. So let me put into the chat room a GitHub URL. This is a protocol called Quick, which will be used for HTTP 3. It'll also be used for other things, but that's the basis for its creation. This specifically is the manageability draft, and I call your attention to section 3, which has to do with network visible information about quick flows. So what you're seeing here, and of course there's a whole bunch of other drafts, many of which have already gone further than this one. There's been a huge amount of work by a bunch of very good people. They have taken a workmanlike professional approach to applying the IAB guidance to this protocol, but it's a very narrow outlook and generally does not question either the basis for needing such encryption or the broader societal or historical context and impacts. So this particular draft was revised a few days ago, and so it's very fresh. It is ready for anyone to comment on. I urge you to read it carefully and to decide whether this presents some of the same unfortunate and blinded implications as DOH itself and ECH. In other words, none of these protocols exists in a vacuum. There's continuity. While I have the floor, let me also ask, can I share screen?
Of course you can, yes. Let me stop share, because that probably
there we go. So this is, let me see if I can shrink it so that it expands. Hopefully you guys can read this text. This is the world answering back in ignorance of DOH and ECH and Quick, but this is the world answering back on the topic of basically 8890. It's trying to say, look, the US government and the economy it tries to protect cannot cope with true unfiltered DNS. The endpoints are not secure, cannot be secured, will never be secure. You must use some kind of filtering. In other words, you've got to use a DNS service that lies to you about the existence of things. And it goes on to give some examples of what a protective DNS system might be. Quad 9 is represented, DNS filter is represented. I think Heimdall in Europe is represented, and so forth. This information will not have an impact on the IETF's production of standards unless concerned internet citizens, such as some of the people on this call, decides to take an interest. Thank you. Those were my statements.
Thanks, Paul. And in fact, that was pretty much me running through very briefly a summary of the sort of key points in terms of just looking at the impacts of ECH from the perspective of those two very specific sectors. I posted the URL to the documents earlier in the chat, so you can see those if anyone wants to read in more detail. Well, I've obviously very heavily summarized. I'm conscious that some of you have been quite closely involved in the development of ECH and quite likely will have a different perspective on it. So I thought it'd be useful to open up for comments and just broaden the discussion more generally. So I see, Peter, you've raised your hand, so do you want to come in?
Hi, thanks, Andrew. It's a really nice summary. I have a question though. Why was it just those two sectors that was focused on, the education and finance? Sorry if I missed something.
No, to be fair, I didn't say why. So
No.
you miss it. But that's a very good question. I should have said why. To be fair, it was partly a question of manageability. So I thought it was important to drill down into some sectors rather than just talk in broad generalities, because otherwise it's not particularly meaningful. And I worked on the assumption, admittedly without having had the discussion, that those were two sectors that could well be affected, which isn't to say that others aren't. But that was my sort of starting assumption, that they likely would be affected, but quite possibly weren't aware of the developments. And again, to sort of broadly summarize what was discussed in the roundtable, yes, I think the conclusion was they do both appear to be affected, and certainly the individuals in the discussion didn't have prior information or awareness of the development of ECH, and you know, since they were reasonably knowledgeable from a technical perspective. Again, you know, we can't obviously talk to every single person in either of those two sectors, but if those individuals weren't aware, I'd say the awareness in the two sectors is probably quite low. And that's really why I think that it's important to see better multi-stakeholder discussions with such developments, because they do have real-world impacts. And you know, let's face it, most of the world is not represented in the IETF. So the IETF, I think, needs to reach out to the world rather than assuming that the world will look in realistically.
Sure. And the proposed multi-stakeholder investigations, was that going to be focused on the education and financial industries, or would it be wider ranging?
So no, it needs to be wider ranging than that. So even if it's to prove that, you know, let's say by chance those are the only two sectors that have significant negative impacts, which is, you know, entirely possible, since they're not, you know, it's a small sample. But you know, I think taking the fact that their lack of awareness is probably representative of the other sectors, the engagement needs to be much broader in order to find out what other sectors, if any, are affected, and you know, what mitigations may they need to consider.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Anyone else have any questions you want to bring to the fore, or any observations, both of which will be entirely valid? And I will try and look in the chat at the same time, but whilst I'm looking at that, John, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think I'll second all of Paul's comments, unsurprisingly. But I think the one comment I'd like to make is that, you know, follow the money seems to be the only viable solution path here. The impact to these different organizations, as far as what its costs are going to be to them for these secondary, more privacy invasive models, has to be, I think, accentuated in order for anyone to care. And while we can raise it from an intellectual perspective and make people aware of these problems, you know, some of us have dogs in the fight and some don't, right? The final end users who are going to bear the costs of this, I think, are where the focus needs to be put most, because that's going to be what drives decisions. I mean, the tech industry has certain things that they're doing, and that drives their motivations to build some of these. Some of them are altruistic, but I think a lot of it is also ultimately driven by bottom line. So we need to focus on that and look at what the costs are going to be, as well as what the political implications are going to be.
Yeah, and certainly completely agree with that. Again, and it probably wasn't intended to be glib, but the text in the RFC that sort of suggested that the suitable alternatives existed, but didn't really consider the operational or financial implications of introducing them, even if they do exist. So yeah, I can completely agree with your view of looking at the financial implications is very important.
And what's more interesting is what doesn't exist yet and what will exist soon. Some of the implications that new technology is going to be built, which is much more invasive, and that's, I think, a much scarier proposition than even what exists today.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks, John. Dominique?
Yeah, and John's point about the new technology that's more invasive was one of my points, because I think that is much scarier. Also, I think there's a comment about findings to be published by Neil. I think it'd be really interesting to try and compile data beyond that actually shows this, including cost, which I keep thinking about cost to operators and others. And if there's any way to do that, that might be some sort of recommendation as well. But the other thing I was going to say is this, to me, just completely backs up my my ongoing issue and assertion and work on consolidation, because one of the points you made is also another point that I was thinking about, and that it drives the potential control of filtering to once again to the to the companies that are behind a lot of the development of this. It's just something that I keep seeing over and over. Thanks.
Yeah. That was partly why I sort of flagged the potential antitrust aspect that maybe needs to be considered as well. But yeah, agreed. Thanks, Dominique. Paul?
So I want to amplify John's point. There's going to be none of this happens in a vacuum, just as none of the original well documented by Snowden and others offenses which led to this state of affairs could happen in a vacuum. Everything that is a tick creates its own talk, and so we will see a very different edge. And so there's a political argument to be made that you'd rather that technology be more draconian in order to foment revolution. And so telling people that it's about to get worse is actually telling some people that they're doing the right thing. I just want to call out the IETF is not going to look at the wider world as you asked, in order to find out what is the context of their work. And the wider world is not going to be looking at what the IETF is doing. So these are ships passing in the night. Then that's the information economics of it. Very few people, even on this call, very few people have the time and the travel budget to focus on everything that might be going on in this and other standards organizations. And so what you get is a coalition of the interested. And that is, it's having some perverse impacts. Anyway, this week I'll be giving a talk about how to do protective DNS, even if for whichever reason you don't want to use DNS filter, Quad 9, any of those, because it's, I think, vital to get the information out there that, yes, you should be using protective DNS, but you don't have to outsource your DNS in order to do so. So I hope none of our cloud operators will take umbrage. I mean nothing bad by it. I think there is a place for both technologies, but my audience here is CISOs, because it is not just the cost of the new sort of less transparent firewall that everybody's going to have, and the cost of all of your IoT devices breaking because they don't know how to find that, and there's, by the IETF's own decision, there's no protocol for locating such a thing. There will be the cost of everybody having to suddenly use an explicit proxy, to the IDS approach, that used to just kind of blindly turn it on and assume that the edge of their managed private network was doing the right thing. All of that's going away, and the impact on that is going to be felt much more by the CISOs than it is going to be by the CFOs, although both are likely to get out of their chairs and say, what the heck is going on here? But just to amplify that point and to clarify, there are other audiences beyond the monetary cost, right? There is an operational security loss that is about to occur at grand scale, and that is treated as necessary collateral damage by those in the IETF who are aware of it, which is a minority. Thank you.
Could you, Paul, share the URL for that session? Are you able to do that?
It is done.
Perfect, thanks. And answering the question that Neil asked in the chat, yes, they certainly, the outputs from the discussion, the findings will be shared, certainly with the education and finance sectors. Although if anyone has any suggestions how to amplify that with those two sectors, by all means get in touch with me offline. If you have a moment, your suggestions will be appreciated. But thanks, Paul. And yes, this is being recorded, in case anyone missed that for whatever reason, to also share as well. So we'll share the link to the recording afterwards as well. Now I'm conscious that thus far people seem to be broadly sympathetic with the analysis. Does anyone on the call have a completely different take, just in the interest of balance? Because I think that will be useful to surface as well if anyone has a different analysis. So let's pause for a moment in case anyone does. Apparently not at the moment. Well, if you do, maybe share it afterwards if anything springs to mind, and we can certainly pick up the discussion next week if need be. Well, once people have had a chance to review the relevant documents. Well, hopefully that was useful. And yes, Kurt's point, no, there don't appear to be any North Koreans on the call today, slightly unusually, but there you are. Yeah, anyway, so as I say, the documents are available on the URL that I shared earlier, and I'll share with a link to the recording as well, so you can review those at your leisure. And as I say, seriously, if you do have any comments, once you have a chance to look at those and want to share those either via email or on the call next week, that will be certainly very interested to see. Okay, well, that was the main thing I wanted to sort of cover on the call today, so I'm hoping that was useful for people. Is there anything else that anyone wants to bring up today whilst we are gathered on the call? Neil.
Hi, Andrew. Sorry, I'll find the mute button. I'll ask this question. In terms of that publication with those sectors and maybe wider, obviously you've sent a link. Is there going to be some sort of release or blog post so we can share it with our wider sort of social media communities and other people that we may want to move that onto? Obviously, I'm conscious that probably there are a number of contacts that I have from a previous life, but obviously there's probably many others on this call here that will be able to spread that message further and wider. But it would be nice to have something that's consistent or they're ready to go. So I don't want to do that and jump the gun unnecessarily.
Yeah. So two things. I mean, obviously you can certainly share the link with directly to the material, which I just posted again in the chat in case anyone joined the chat after we started and missed it. So that will take you to the sort of 2 documents. I've also reached out to Circle ID to see if they would be interested in carrying a piece to obviously summarize some of the key points, to give us sort of a third-party sort of summary of the material. But again, if anyone's got any suggestions as to alternative locations, because I'm waiting to hear back from Circle ID to see if that's something they would want to carry or not. But if anyone's got any thoughts on other places, other publications that might be interested in looking at this, those would be gratefully received as well.
I think Circle ID is going to love this plan. If they don't, you should ask for an introduction. But really, it doesn't matter where it goes. What it does matter is that the people on this call all learn about the URL and post about it in all of the social networking platforms where you are present.
Yeah,
that is what will get attention, not where it starts from, but what we do with it for amplification.
Yeah, fair point. Well, I'll persevere with Circle ID just because I've already reached out to them. If anyone's got any bright ideas on any other locations, sort of do please let me know. The other option I was looking at, if I don't hear back soon from Circle ID, might be Write NCC on their blog. But any other thoughts, greatly received. But I do take your point, Paul, that within reason it doesn't matter too much, because we can obviously share the link in any case. Okay, thanks. Thanks for the question, Neil. Any other topics that anyone wishes to bring up this week? Anything else that'd be useful to talk about? Trust you've all seen that IETF 112 won't in fact be in person, but will be virtual. And if my reading of the stats is correct, I'd say there's a reasonably good probability that IETF 113 won't take place in Bangkok next March either, which is sad. So surprisingly, Philadelphia, I think, if I remember rightly, the IETF schedules in nearly 12 months' time might be the sort of next face-to-face opportunity of the IETF community, which is quite sad it's so far away, but there you are. I can see that someone who probably isn't called iPad DMPY whatever, but in fact it's Glenn.
Yeah, we have a new MDM at Comcast, and I've had to reset all my devices, which means that configurations have all got blown away. Yay!
It's actually a little known secret. That's Glenn's birth certificate name. He just adopted a more common one for online.
Well, even more obscure is the fact that I'm actually Elon Musk's new adopted son, and that's my new cool name. Unfortunately, Dad is a cheapskate and won't give me an allowance. Anyhow, hey, I just want to say on IETF 114, yeah, it's in Philly, and it will be hosted by ABC, Universal, and Comcast. And the social is already being worked on, so you know, mark the date and plan to be in Philly. I'm sure it'll be a very cool, dry July, because Julys on the East Coast are always very, very dry and very cool. But
unlike August in New York, having seen the news yesterday, which looked anything but.
yeah, I think we're going to plan for an inside event.
But yeah, I suppose if you've got 12 months preparation time, it should be fantastic social events.
Anyways, I thought I'd help us go out on a happy note instead of the gloomy CH note.
Yeah, no, that sounds fair. Hopefully beer will be involved.
There will be beer. I will always guarantee that any event I throw will have beer.
Perhaps that should be the strap line for the event. IETF 114, there will be beer. Brilliant. Okay, well, that's good to know that Comcast, NBC, Universal, whatever, will be hosting. Fantastic. See Simon's thoughts on your former name are also interesting to see, but I won't read that out loud. Okay, anyone else wants to bring forward? If not, I'll take it then that we've probably finished for this week. So please take the opportunity to sort of peruse those two documents using the link provided offline. Any comments appreciated, but similarly, any thoughts on parties that might be interested in carrying the analysis equally well received when you've had a chance to think about it. But other than that, thanks everyone for your time. Have a great Monday and enjoy the rest of the week. Thanks all.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks all.